My Fair Lady. In the 1964 film My Fair Lady, Eliza Doolittle quietly returns to Professor Henry Higgins, prompting his now famous question, "Where the devil are my slippers?" The moment is subtle, but it conveys reconciliation and possibly something more. That gentle pivot, however, runs counter to George Bernard Shaw's earliest intention. In his 1913 play Pygmalion, and in a prose sequel published in 1916, Shaw specifies that Eliza does not stay with Higgins. She marries Freddie, aiming for autonomy rather than passion. Shaw maintained that romanticizing Eliza's homecoming would, in his words, completely destroy the play's purpose. By the early 1960s, however, audiences gravitated toward feel-good finales, and grand musicals reigned at the box office. The Broadway rendition of My Fair Lady had already softened the narrative, and when Tinseltown brought it to the screen, the conclusion followed suit. After Shaw's death in 1950, his estate, once fiercely protective, agreed to the adaptation, reportedly swayed by the musical's enormous success. Some say debate flared among the estate's trustees, with a few resisting any nod to a romantic finale. Rex Harrison's portrayal of Higgins muddied the waters even more. His charismatic portrayal made the professor warmer than Shaw's harsh, domineering figure. Contemporary reviews applauded the performances. The New York Times branded Harrison brilliantly sardonic, but raised questions about the altered resolution. Cinema historian David Thompson later noted that the adaptation traded Shaw's biting commentary for a fairy tale. The outcome? A beloved cinematic classic that replaced feminist defiance with a slipper-fetching finish. Even decades later, the controversy endures. Was it artistic sacrifice or commercial savvy? A Farewell to Arms. In 1932, Paramount's A Farewell to Arms replaced Hemingway's harsh final chapter with a sweeter finale. In the novel, Catherine dies after childbirth complications, leaving Frederick devastated and forced into the rain alone. But the film softened that blow. Catherine breathes her last in Frederick's arms, awash in sentimental music and drawn-out close-ups, an ending many deemed more Hollywood than Hemingway. The studio's rationale wasn't purely creative. The Hays Code had been enacted in 1930, and despite not being strictly enforced until 1934, studios were already giving into its pressure. Bleak conclusions, especially those hinting at moral shades of gray or anti-war sentiments, felt perilous. Several film scholars assert that this modified ending was crafted to avert controversy and allure a broader crowd. While no direct evidence survives of Hemingway's exact views, most biographers mention his blatant displeasure with Hollywood's meddling, naming this adaptation as a key point in his coldness toward the movie business. Even the 1957 remake, starring Rock Hudson and Jennifer Jones, hewed more faithfully to the book's events, yet still lacked raw intensity. Less stark realism, more refined gloss. Legend runs that from this juncture forward, Hemingway grew increasingly wary of cinematic treatments, convinced the medium had a knack for turning stark tragedy into digestible melodrama. The Bridge on the River Quai. In Pierre Boulier's 1952 novel The Bridge over the River Quai, the bridge does collapse, but not in an explosive cinematic showstopper. Instead, British commandos sabotage it, and Colonel Nicholson, the British officer in charge, is gunned down and topples onto the detonator in a moment of grim irony. The novel wraps up on a somber note, spotlighting war's absurdities and the thin line between honor and obsession. David Lean's 1957 film adaptation amplifies that cautionary message into a grand spectacle. The bridge is blown sky high amid the thunder of an oncoming train, delivering one of mid-century cinema's most unforgettable climaxes. Yet that flourish carried a cost. The adaptation shifts the emphasis from the novel's subdued skepticism to a more charged, almost heroic narrative. Nicholson, portrayed by Alec Guinness, emerges not so much a deluded commander as a tragic figure, an interpretation that some maintain weakens Boulier's original critique. Although Boulier is listed as the screenplay's writer, Carl Foreman and Michael Wilson, two blacklisted Americans working in secret, were the real authors. Pierre, who knew no English, accepted the Best Adapted Screenplay Oscar on their behalf. It wasn't until 1985 that the Academy finally acknowledged Foreman and Wilson's roles. Certain cinema scholars believe the revised finale served more than just visual impact. It could have been a bid to match post-war Western ideals, where moral certainty and riveting justice played better than murky reflections on military arrogance. Intentional or not, the change steered the story away from the novel's reserved tone. In Bouillet's version, the bridge's destruction is a footnote in a greater indictment of conflict. On screen, it becomes the main attraction. The Bad Seed. In 1956, Warner Brothers introduced The Bad Seed, a disturbing drama that collided with Hollywood's tight moral restrictions. Adapted from William March's 1954 novel, the plot revolved around Rhoda Penmark, a sweet-faced child who kills without remorse. In the book, and in the subsequent Broadway play, Rhoda eludes punishment entirely, delivering a chilling message. Evil can flourish in daylight. But by the time the film emerged, that bleak takeaway had been thoroughly overhauled. The reason? The Motion Picture Production Code, commonly dubbed the Hays Code. Instituted from 1934 to the late 1960s, it required that wrongdoing be penalized on screen. That stance clashed with March's original ending. Under pressure from censors, director Mervyn Leroy reworked the finale. Instead of Rhoda escaping unscathed, lightning strikes her while she retrieves a keepsake at the site of one of her crimes. The abrupt jolt appeased the code, but conflicted with the psychological honesty that grounded the source novel. Speculation has long persisted that a closer-to-the-text ending was at least contemplated, if not partially shot. Some even whisper that abandoned footage might be nestled in studio archives, though none has ever appeared. What the public did see was an unusual curtain call. Nancy Kelly feigning a scolding of Patty McCormack, who portrayed Rhoda, an odd comedic touch many interpret as a wry grin at the audience, and perhaps a gentle protest on the filmmaker's part. Though not typically listed among the most famous adaptation shifts, The Bad Seed serves as a notable illustration of censorship reshaping a story's central thrust. In a cinematic realm fixated on moral certainty, even a child antagonist was destined to face a sweeping comeuppance. The Picture of Dorian Gay. MGM's 1945 adaptation of The Picture of Dorian Gay did more than adjust Oscar Wilde's conclusion. It inverted its meaning entirely. In the novel, Dorian's self-inflicted death is drenched in dark irony. He destroys the portrait in desperation, only to die himself, grotesquely aged. Yet this production, directed by Albert Lewin, recast the finale as moral retribution. The painting's sudden return to innocence isn't tragic, it's justice, aligned with the Hollywood production code's mandate that wrongdoing must be punished. To satisfy those standards, the movie magnified Basil Hallward's function as a moral compass and introduced a more prominent romantic subplot with Gladys, heightening emotional stakes not evident in Wilde's text. The most stunning modification was visual. The cursed portrait, presented in vivid Technicolor while the rest of the adaptation remained in black and white, shifted into a horrifying spectacle, its hues growing more lurid with each of Dorian's transgressions. Reviewers like Bosley Crowther of the New York Times hailed the effect as a brilliant shock device, though others found it dulled, Wilde's sharp satire. Several cinema scholars proposed that MGM leaned into the paranormal visuals to divert attention from the novel's more provocative themes. Wilde's indulgent critique of Victorian morality was refashioned by Lewin into a moral lesson with a decisive endpoint. The mystery was lost, supplanted by a cinematic sermon wrapped in Gothic style. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. In 1941, MGM's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde swapped psychological terror for moral definiteness, concluding with an outcome at odds with Robert Louis Stevenson's original design. Whereas the novella finishes with Jekyll irreversibly subsumed by his monstrous counterpart, this adaptation gives him a redeeming death. Spencer Tracy's Jekyll expires after reverting from Hyde, hinting at remorse. A tidied-up departure shaped by the stringent Hays Code, in effect since 1934. Under those rules, moral ambiguity was risky, and wrongdoing had to be punished. Consequently, screenwriter John Lee Mahan recast the narrative as a cautionary lesson, even weaving in a love angle to soften the bleak edges. Observers were unconvinced. The New York Times praised the production values, but labeled it a faint echo of the rawer 1931 rendition starring Frederick March. That earlier film had embraced dreadful transformation and psychological collapse, facets the 1941 version deliberately evaded. Behind the scenes, tensions rose. Tracy apparently despised the elaborate Hyde prosthetics, arguing they were over the top and hurt his performance. Some insiders whispered that he believed himself miscast, favoring a subtler psychological approach over showy horror. The studio, however, craved spectacle. The result? A finale that swapped existential outrage for moral rectitude, clean, rule-abiding, and distant from Stevenson's grim finale. The Robe. In 1953, The Robe famously became the first feature to debut in widescreen CinemaScope, but its finale rewrote more than just cinematic conventions. In Lloyd C. Douglas's 1942 book Marcellus Gallio and his companion Diana survive and keep spreading Christianity, underscoring the theme of spiritual perseverance. The screen adaptation reverses that trajectory, sending both characters to public execution, pictured as martyrs in a grand emotionally charged climax. This sweeping deviation wasn't merely a creative tweak, it was a complete divergence from the source material's core message. Some film analysts suggest the change intended to forge a more spectacular conclusion that suited the wide frame format's grandeur. Others theorize it aligned with the period's craving for redemptive suffering and religious dramas. Although no official explanation appeared, the alternative finale stirred enduring debate about Hollywood's inclination to prize spectacle over literary fidelity. Despite this departure, The Robe was a commercial triumph and received 5 Academy Award nods, including Best Picture. Its conclusion remains among the most striking modifications of mid-century cinema, reshaping a novel to suit the big screen. King Solomon's Mines. In 1950, MGM unveiled King Solomon's Mines, a vivid adventure that set aside the book's murkier moral overtones in favor of romance and spectacle. H. Rider Haggard's 1885 novel concludes with the adventurers surviving but forfeiting most of the treasure, hinting at commentary on greed and the boundaries of imperial pursuit. The motion picture, by contrast, revised that ending into a typical Hollywood getaway, complete with a blossoming love connection between characters who rarely intersected in the original text. Deborah Kerr and Stuart Granger's screen chemistry lit a spark, yet it had no source in the novel. Observers at the time remarked on this alteration, and a few literary circles labeled it a betrayal of Haggard's intent. The Academy, however, applauded the project with awards for Best Cinematography, Color, and Best Film Editing. Some suggest the studio softened the conclusion in tune with post-war American cheer, eschewing the book's sobering insights. Others argue it was a calculated strategy to entice audiences seeking escapism rather than introspection. Either way, the resulting cut turned a cautionary narrative into a flashy jungle romance, leaving the novel's deeper critique buried amid the glimmer of lost gold. Lost Horizon. Lost Horizon, released in 1937, is often remembered for its idyllic vision of Shangri-La, but this motion picture's finale subtly diverged from James Hilton's original novel in tone rather than in outcome. In both versions, Robert Conway eventually returns to the mythical mountain refuge, but where Hilton left his fate wrapped in ambiguity, Frank Capra leaned into romantic closure. The novel concludes with a framing narrative suggesting, not confirming, Conway's return, leaving readers to wonder if Shangri-La was real or a symbol of escapism. Capra, influenced by the pressures of the Great Depression and Columbia Pictures' desire for hope-driven storytelling, chose a more definitive homecoming. Studio records show that this adaptation was trimmed significantly after its premiere, with over 30 minutes of footage removed, though claims that these scenes revealed Shangri-La as an illusion remain speculative at best. A number of movie scholars argue Capra's own idealism may have shaped the conclusion more than executive interference. Others point to persistent rumors that early drafts contained a darker psychological edge, hinting at Conway's mental unraveling. While not an outrageous departure from the source text, the transition from philosophical ambiguity to emotional certainty reveals more about Hollywood's mood in the late 1930s than about narrative necessity. Breakfast at Tiffanys. In 1961, Paramount released Breakfast at Tiffanys, a polished romantic drama that took bold liberties with Truman Capote's original novella. The most striking change? The ending. In Capote's version, Holly Golightly vanishes without explanation, leaving behind only a nameless cat and a lingering sorrow. The narrator is left to wonder where she went. No resolution, no reunion. But the film opts for a neat Hollywood send-off. Audrey Hepburn's Holly comes back, tearfully reuniting with George Peppard's character in the rain. That moment, now iconic, never existed in Capote's text. Studio executives reportedly advocated for the switch, convinced viewers preferred closure over self-reflection. Capote, though he praised parts of the adaptation, did not hide his annoyance with the casting. He had pictured Marilyn Monroe in the lead, and openly argued that Hepburn lacked the rawness and fragility he envisioned in Holly. Whispers circulated that Monroe refused the role on Lee Strasberg's advice, fearing potential harm to her image. True or not, the choice of leading lady became a source of ongoing debate. The production ultimately won 2 Academy Awards, but not for Hepburn. Contrary to popular belief, she was never even nominated. Over time, the ending thrilled audiences. Yet for purists, it remains one of vintage Hollywood's most sanitized rewrites. An instance where a tale about liberation and solitude was reimagined as a romance neatly tied with a bow. If you've enjoyed this video, please leave a like and comment. Also consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell to get notified of our new videos each week. Thanks for watching.